Welcome to Treasures from the Rabbi's Library, episode 7. I'm delighted to say that this Treasures video, this Treasures session, is sponsored by George and Susie Fishman in memory of Susie's father, Laszlo Weiss, Shmuel ben Yosef Halevi, Zichrono Libracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 17th of Iyar. His neshama should have an aliyah, and we should all be zoicha to see Techias HaMesim B'Korov. Thank you so much for being with me. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to talk about a very interesting topic today, and I'm not going to do it justice. I want to make that clear. Right from the outset, I'm not going to do it justice. However, I have so many publications and books regarding this matter that I can't just say, okay, I'm going to wait until I do a full-on lecture about it. I am going to try my best to address this matter in the best way that I can, in using the publications, the books, the polemics that I have gathered over the years that I've found nestling in one of my boxes and on the shelves. I've put them all together and here they are. Okay, we're going to begin with something, it's an important thing you should know about. There's something which in the academic world is very, very important. You don't see it so much in the rabbinic world, although it does exist, and it's called a Festschrift. A Festschrift is when somebody reaches some milestone moment in their life, their 70th birthday, their 50th year in a particular college or whatever it is, the end of their career, they're about to retire, and all their colleagues put together a bunch of articles on a variety of topics relating to the particular field that is most associated with that academic in one book, and it's the best of everything, and they put it together and they present it to him as a legacy for his contribution to whatever subject matter we're discussing. Now, obviously in Jewish history it's very important because sometimes the most important articles about a particular topic are found in some obscure Festschrift. So if you want to know about that topic, you've got to have the Festschrift. So here I have a Festschrift, Studies in Jewish Bibliography, History and Literature, and it's in honor of I. Edward Kiev. We have a picture. I'm not sure I sent Carly a scan of this picture, but that's Professor Kiev. It was edited by Charles Berlin. Now, Charles Berlin is a good friend of mine, an important person. You should know him. Dr. Charles Berlin is in charge of the Harvard Library of Jewish and Hebrew Studies. Exceptionally important person. I've collaborated with him and communicated with him for over 20 years. And the Harvard Library is one of the most significant Judaica libraries in the world. Charles Berlin put together this Festschrift in honor of I. Edward Kiev. I'm not going to go into any detail about Professor Kiev, but I am going to discuss one particular article which was written by Moshe Pelly. By the way, we'll get to Moshe Pelly in a minute. This was published in 1971, almost 50 years ago. Quite something. Moshe Pelly was born in 1936. I have no idea where he is today. The last we heard of him, he was in Florida. So if somebody can tell me whether or not he's still active, I would love to know. And I would love to share this episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library with him somehow. If he's born in 1936, that means he's 84 years old, and I need an email address for him. So if you can somehow find him, I would be very grateful, and I would love to be in communication with him. Moshe Pelly, in his article in the Festschrift for Professor Kiev, edited by Charles Berlin, wrote the following: the methodology employed by the Hebrew reformers in the first Reform Temple controversy, which he dates as between 1818 and 1819. I'm not going to disagree with him, but I will tell you that the controversy actually was rather longer than that. It extended to 1821. What happened at the Hamburg temple? Well, if you want to know part of the story, you can read Moshe Pelly's article. He deliberately, and actually notes that, leaves out the contribution of a particularly virulent polemicist called David Caro, who we'll get to because I have one of his publications. But he gives us all the main issues that were discussed, described, and polemicized about during the course of this terrible, terrible controversy. Now, I'm going to begin not in 1818 and not in 1819, but actually earlier on. So we're all familiar because I've discussed it before in one of my lectures. You can watch it on my website. For those of you who don't have my web address, www.rabbidunner.com, I have a lecture there on the contribution of a gentleman by the name Moshe Dessau, also known as Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn is considered the foundational figure of the Reform movement within Judaism. He wasn't a Reform Jew. He was fully traditional, never called himself rabbi. If you listen to the lecture, you'll hear about his particular contribution to the Jewish faith. And the fact is that he was an exceptional scholar and, to a certain degree, a great man. He lived in a particular environment at a particular time and in particular circumstances, which resulted in many of his teachings being treated in a particular way, and that eventually evolved into the Reform movement. I'm going to take a step back just because I want to give you this backdrop. It's important to know. We live in a very unusual world. In the 21st century, being a Jew is not considered political, unless, of course, you're a supporter of the State of Israel. But putting that aside, I know it's not easy to put it aside, but put that aside, being a Jew is not political. It doesn't mean you're against the state if you go to synagogue or if you give your money to a Jewish charity. But being a Jew in the late 18th and early 19th century was a political statement. It meant you weren't part of the state. Why? Because there was no separation between church and state. And therefore, if you were Jewish, you were making a statement that you are not part of whatever state you lived in because you practiced a different faith. Now, if you lived in a Protestant country, that meant you weren't a Protestant. If you lived in a Catholic country, it meant you weren't a Catholic. But whatever it was, you certainly weren't a Christian. And what that meant was two things. There were two tensions that existed within people who were descended from Jews. I'm going to put it that way. The first was, we need to assimilate, and in order to assimilate, we are going to convert to Christianity. Were they fully believing Christians? I have no idea. It's not important. What it meant is that they threw in their lot, as far as their future was concerned, with Christians. The most famous example of this was Moses Mendelssohn's own children. And the most famous composer of the early part of the 19th century was Mendelssohn, a grandson of the great Moses Mendelssohn, who was a Christian. Now, he cooperated with Jews. He felt he was of Jewish descent. He was proud of his Jewish heritage, but he was a Christian. In England, a little bit later on in the 19th century, we had Benjamin Disraeli, who became the British Prime Minister. He is known as being Queen Victoria's favourite Prime Minister. He was a Christian. His father was a member of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, but in order to further the interests of his family, ultimately the family converted to Christianity. That was one stress. That was one tension that existed for the Jews of that period. The other one was, no, we want to remain true to our Jewish faith, but we're going to, and I'm going to use this word, it's not used by historians, it's not used by theologians, but it is used by Rabbi Dunner. They wanted to Christianize Judaism. How do you Christianize the Jewish faith? By making the beliefs that fly in the face of Christianity more innocuous. For example, Messianism. How do we address Messianism? Well, we believe in Mashiach, Mashiach Tzidkenu, Mashiach ben David. He's going to come and bring us back to Zion, to the Holy Land, and we're going to build the Beis HaMikdash. It's not complicated. You don't have to be a great Kabbalist or great theologian to know that. However, if you want to ingratiate yourself with Christians, you're not going to want to believe in that kind of personal Jewish Messiah. You're going to want to generalize the Messianic faith and say that there will be a Messiah that will save all of humanity from its sins and bring it into a redemption. Humanity will be redeemed through the appearance of a Messiah. We don't exclude anyone from the Messianic redemption. Now, it happens to be that in Judaism, we don't exclude anyone from Messianic redemption unless they deliberately persecuted the Jews or wanted to deny the faith of God. Unlike other faiths, which say unless you believe in our faith, you cannot be deserving of the Messianic redemption. Having said that, the early reformers, I call them Christianizers, wanted to change the Jewish faith so that it would be more acceptable to Christians. There were other issues, big issues. Do you know what they were? People's behavior in shul. How do Jews pray in shul? Well, we're quite relaxed about it. We schmooze to our friends, we sing, we dance, and we read the Torah using ancient cantillations. Well, those who had ever attended a Christian service at church knew at that time that they were far more organized in their service and that the decorum in a church was very different than the one you would experience in shul. And therefore, as part of this, let's call it Christianization program, let's make our services more like a church service, because surely that will mean that the non-Jews will accept the Jews. Because even though we are of a different faith, we are so similar to their faith in terms of the way we worship our God, then we will be accepted by the non-Jews. So those were the tensions that existed at the very beginning of what we now refer to as the Reform movement, the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Now, it all began in Berlin. Berlin was the capital of Prussia. And in Berlin, there was a man called Israel Jacobson, Yisrael Jacobson, and he opened a prayer house in Siessen. He wanted to make sure that he could serve the Jews who wanted to be more modern in terms of their desires, their needs of being frum Jews. And he called it a temple. Why did he call it a temple? So it's interesting. The word temple has connotations. Where do we consider the place that there was a temple in Judaism? Jerusalem. What if we are universalist in our messianic aims? Are we aiming for Jews to return to Zion, Jerusalem, and build a temple? Or are we saying that wherever you are, you can build a temple? Now, there's enough in Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, that says that wherever you build a synagogue, it's like a mini Jerusalem. It's a Gemara in Megillah, it's a Gemara in Brachos. You can find sources within Chazal that allow you to refer to a synagogue as a temple. But when it takes on political overtones, then it's a totally different matter altogether. That's what we're going to see here. A lot of this is to do with intent. What was going on behind? The word temple is innocuous if all it means is that we have a mikdash ma'at. But if it means that the temple that we have in Berlin is to the exclusion of a temple being rebuilt in Jerusalem, that's quite a different matter altogether. So this Israel Jacobson, he wanted to make sure that all the sermons that were given in the synagogue were in German. Now, most rabbis in those days didn't speak German. Most rabbis, in fact, only spoke one language if they lived in Europe. Do you know what that language was? It was called Jüdisch Deutsch. We call it Yiddish. Jüdisch Deutsch was a dialect of German which included many Hebrew words and Polish words and Russian words, but essentially was a Germanic language that had been adopted and developed by Jews over many centuries and had become unique to them. There was no one in Germany who spoke Jüdisch Deutsch besides for Jews. It was a dialect. And that dialect was considered to be the language of Jews. It was the vernacular of the Jewish faith, to the extent that nobody spoke Hebrew. Very few people could write Hebrew. They could read Hebrew. Even the Hebrew that is written using Hebrew, the Yiddish written using Hebrew letters, is written in a totally different way than Hebrew, because it uses vowel letters as opposed to vowels. So for example, Aleph is ah and o, and that's whereas we would use a pasach or komatz in Hebrew. And in fact, when we read Hebrew, we don't have vowels at all, because if you're familiar with reading Hebrew, you'll know what the word says. Ayin is an e sound, and those were the vowels that were used in Yiddish. This was a language which was the language of instruction and the language of communication in the Jewish world. Yiddish, Jüdisch Deutsch. Now, to speak German, High German particularly, in a synagogue meant that you were making a political point. I don't want to be like those obscurantist Eastern European Ostjuden, the people who speak that foreign language called Jüdisch Deutsch. I want to speak proper German. And therefore the rabbi has to give a drosha in German. You know, when they first came to this country, to the United States, the rabbis of all the synagogues here, including the Reform synagogues, would give their sermons in German, not English. German was considered the superior language of instruction, of religious instruction. And as a result, one of the first innovations that the Reform instituted, was that all sermons had to be given in German. The other thing that they wanted to do was to change all the pronunciation of Hebrew to Sephardic pronunciation. Now today we're very familiar with that, because Ivrit is delivered using Sephardic pronunciation. But in those days, there was a variety of different pronunciations. If you came from Poland, you pronounce Hebrew in one particular way. If you came from Germany, a totally different way. Russia, totally different than Poland and Germany. And if you came from France, it was different than Germany as well. Everybody had their own, as it were, dialect of Hebrew pronunciation. These early reformers decided that it is not appropriate to have all this variety in Hebrew. Hebrew is one language. You can't have different pronunciations. By the way, it makes no sense. So I know that from an academic, intellectual perspective, it makes perfect sense. This is the way we pronounce things. And you give instructions from on high. I'll tell you how to pronounce something. Don't tell me how you pronounce it. But you know how the language works. I mean, you're listening to me. I'm speaking with a British accent. Is my accent any more correct or less correct than those who speak with an American accent or a South African accent or an Australian accent, or the many accents that exist here in the United States? There are those who speak with a New York accent, or with a deep Southern accent, or Midwestern accent, or this perfected Mid-Atlantic accent which exists, which is somewhere in between Britain and America. There's no such thing as a perfect accent. But those people who want to impose reform want to tell you that no, there's only one way to pronounce something, and if you pronounce it differently, you're pronouncing it wrong. That's not true at all. The way you pronounce it, as long as you are consistent in your pronunciation all the way through, is correct. In fact, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, in the introduction to his Siddur, has a long preamble in which he discusses, among other things, about the Germanic, the Ashkenaz pronunciation of Hebrew. He wants to claim that that is the most correct pronunciation of Hebrew. I'm not going to say whether I agree with him or don't agree with him, but he offers a very cogent argument as to why the particular vowels and methods of pronunciation that are used by Ashkenaz Jews are correct. The idea that in order for Jewish faith and for worship, and for the reading of the Torah, and for reading of prayers, that they have to be read in a particular way, has to be done in that particular way, otherwise they're done incorrectly. That is something that only the reformers came up with. In fact, many of the mispronunciations that we most associate with Ashkenaz pronunciation of Hebrew are a direct result of the insistence of those early reformers that we modify our pronunciation to fit in with the way that they said Hebrew needs to be enunciated. Another thing was the quiet Shmona Esrei. Quiet Shmona Esrei is a waste of time. It's not brought down anywhere in Chazal that you have to do it that way. Surely if we anyway do a repetition, in any event the Chazan is going to repeat the Shmona Esrei, let everybody say it along with the Chazan, and in that way, and in fact we're going to see in one of the books that I'm going to show you in a moment, that one of the rabbis claimed that the Ramah himself said that when it comes to certain prayers, if it's a little late and coming up to Soif Zman Tefillah, that you can ask the Chazan to say it and people say the Tefillah with the Chazan. And obviously, in other words, there is precedent. This is not a reform. By the way, that's an interesting concept. That reformers never wanted to appear as if they were reforming anything. They just wanted to say that we are using existing precedent. Not very good at being reformers if you're just using existing precedent. But in any event, they would say that the Ramah has already told us that we can use the Chazan's tefillah, his so-called repetition, as the way in which we can discharge our tefillah duty, and in which case we could say it along with the Chazan. I'm just giving you some examples. So I have to tell you, this happened in around 1810. This Israel Jacobson, who obviously had to have been trained in traditional yeshivas and with traditional rabbis, he opened his prayer service, his group, in around 1810. And at that time, the rabbi in Berlin was Rabbi Meir Weil. I mentioned him, by the way, he's a friend of Rabbi Akiva Eger. If you read my article about Rabbi Akiva Eger, you will have seen Rabbi Meir Weil was mentioned. He was a very great rabbi who lived at a very difficult moment in Jewish history. And he protested and he tried to get support from rabbis. And he sent, including to Rabbi Akiva, he sent letters to a number of rabbis saying, I'm being threatened by this group that wants to open another kehillah, another community, which is a kind of reform community. I don't know what words he used. And the response he got was supportive, but not proactive. That's the way I would put it. In other words, we agree with you, but they didn't sense any threat at that stage from reform. I'm going to fast forward a number of years. I'm going to show you this book. This is a book that was written by a man called Eliezer Lieberman. I don't know much about Eliezer Lieberman. It seems that nobody knows very much about him. The book is called, those of you who know my bindings, I love binding in black and red, Noiga HaTzedek. Noiga HaTzedek and Or Noiga, two books in one book. This is the title page, hold on a second, of the second part of the book. Let me find it. Here we go. And Or Noiga. So you've got Or Noiga and you've got Noiga HaTzedek. Eliezer Lieberman was a Talmudic scholar and he lived at that moment in history. We don't know much about him. He says that he's the son of Reb Zev Wolf. Zev and Wolf, by the way, are Wolf is the Yiddish translation or German translation of the word Ze'ev, the name Ze'ev. He was the rabbi in Hagenau, maybe in Alsace. He was an Ashkenazi Jew, and he was an agent and a very strong supporter of those who wanted to open a reform temple in Hamburg. And he published this defensive volume, this book, this Noiga HaTzedek and Or Noiga, and what he did is he collected the opinions of some very distinguished rabbis, but rabbis who clearly were supportive of reformist tendencies. One of them was a man called Rabbi Aaron Chorin. Rabbi Aaron Chorin was the Rav of Budapest. He was an interesting man. Rabbi Aaron Chorin got himself into a lot of trouble because he was so radical. Sorry, he was the Rav of Arad. Rav Moshe Kunitz was the Rav of Budapest. He was also a supporter. Rav Aaron Chorin got himself into a lot of trouble over the years because Rav Aaron Chorin was a person he was a Talmud of the Noida Behuda, and he felt that it was very important to include as many people as possible within the Jewish framework, even those who were drifting away because they were trying to assimilate. And whatever accommodations we could make, as far as he was concerned, were not accommodations enough. One of the big issues that came up in this second decade of the 19th century was the use of musical instruments, particularly an organ, in synagogue services. Now you might think, of course, if you're Orthodox you can't use an organ. Not so simple. On Shabbos, how can you use a musical instrument in shul? And the answer is that it was reserved for the Beis HaMikdash, and now that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, we can't use musical instruments in a shul on Shabbos. That was the accepted custom, that we don't use musical instruments in shul for shul services, which to a certain degree are replications of temple services. That being the case, if you are now in a mode of embracing the synagogue as a recreation of the temple, and actually there's no Chilul Shabbos involved in creating music, but we're simply doing it because it's some custom relating back to the way we commemorate the destruction of the temple. And if it's important for people who come to synagogue to have this aesthetic quality, the music that exists in the synagogue is going to be of the same quality that is going to be in a church, then you have to use an organ. And therefore, for example, Rav Aaron Chorin, the Rav of Arad, this Talmud of the Noida Behuda, said, of course, why not? Use an organ. It's important. It's going to keep people in shul. There were other rabbis I mentioned. Moshe Kunitz. Moshe Kunitz, I've mentioned him before. He was one of those who got into a discussion about the origins of the Zohar. He was very supportive of its authenticity, but he was definitely of reformist tendencies. He was the Rav of Budapest. There were others. There were Sephardi rabbis. There was one of them who was Rabbi Rekanati. He was the chief rabbi of Verona. And there were others, various rabbis, who are quoted here in this book that was published in 1818 by Eliezer Lieberman. Now, Eliezer Lieberman was a troublemaker. Let's be clear. Eliezer Lieberman was not somebody who was a stable, solid, orthodox, rabbinic scholar. He was a man who was very talented, very charismatic. He was a teacher, very involved in Jewish education. And he wanted to make sure that the reformist tendencies would evolve into the Judaism of the present. According to Heinrich Gretz, who is hardly a religious figure, a very famous historian, Jewish historian of the later part of the 19th century, an erstwhile Talmud of Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, although I don't believe he ended his life as an Orthodox Jew. He says that Eliezer Lieberman ultimately converted to Catholicism, became a Christian. But at this stage, in 1818, he was writing in beautiful Hebrew this book, Or Noiga, in which he has these various letters. You've got this one from Yaakov Chai, or Jacob Vita Rekanati from Verona. You've got the letter from Aaron Chorin, who's the Rav of Arad, which is quite a radical letter. It's going to be very important, that letter, because he later retracted it. Then you have the letter from Moshe Kunitz, who's the Rav of Buddha. And then you have Divrei Chochma Musar B'inyonei Avodas Hashem Yisborach. Ye'ir Nesiva Mesila Ila Beis Keil V'Arachayim Lemalo Lemaskil. B'Mo'irois Haskel V'Hakosuv HaKabola. L'chol HaBoim L'Geshes L'Kodesh Penima. V'lishpoich nafsham v'libam b'tfila v'toida b'sofa b'rura v'ne'ima. You want to pray properly. You want to make sure that your prayers are accepted and you want to understand what you're saying. That's the type of Jew you are. A desired service, pure. You want to be able to recite your prayers in a different language. What's the problem with that? And he begins with a beautiful poem. The one thing you can say about the maskilim in those days, and don't forget that at that stage, Hebrew was not a language that was spoken. It wasn't a vernacular. It wasn't something that was spoken between people in their homes. People spoke whatever language they spoke. It was purely a literary language. What happened in Hamburg? Well, they opened up the temple with the support of the various rabbis who had written letters to say that all the innovations that they had come up with weren't that bad. And they made a siddur. Do you see this siddur here? You won't find it in a bookshop. By the way, how do you open a siddur? You open it from right to left, right? That's how you open a siddur. This is the siddur of the Hamburg temple. You don't open it right to left. You open it like a secular book, left to right. It's written in a style that was the people who spoke and read German were used to. Here's the title page. The title page is where we would normally find the back page of a siddur. And this siddur was put together by Isaac Zekel Frenkel and Meir Israel Breslau. Meir Israel Breslau and Isaac Zekel Frenkel, they were activists in the Hamburg temple. The Hamburg temple was for families in Hamburg, and there was a lot of politics going on because the non-Jews didn't want to get into a fight with the Jews, and the Jewish community there was very conservative in terms, I'm talking small c conservative, wanted to keep with the traditions of Orthodox Judaism, even though it wasn't yet referred to as Orthodox. And you had these radicals that insisted on opening a new shul and putting together a siddur for the use in that shul, which included German prayers. Much of it is in German, not translation, prayers. I'm going to point you to two things that I discovered. There's many things in here that I've discovered, but two things which I think are relevant to our discussion. Prayers that are included in this prayer book that fly in the face of what we understand as acceptable Judaism theologically. So you have here, beginning, it's Musaf on Shabbos, okay? Musaf on Shabbos. You have here, by the way, what is Musaf? Musaf is the prayer that is a commemoration of the fact that we were meant to bring a special korban on Shabbos called Korban Musaf. By the way, we also bring a Korban Musaf on Rosh Chodesh, and we bring one on Yom Tov. As a commemoration of that special sacrifice, because we can't bring the sacrifice now, we read it, and we have a principle in halacha that if you say it with a full devotion and with the belief in the sacrificial system, it's as if you brought the sacrifice. The words that you say are sufficient for you to have discharged your duty in terms of bringing the Korban Musaf. There's a big problem though. If you are somebody who's trying to Christianize Judaism, you no longer believe in sacrifice. You no longer believe in bringing animals for ritual slaughter to a temple in Jerusalem. How are you going to reconcile that with a tefillah called Musaf on Shabbos? I'll read it to you. You ready? So this is, we begin we begin Tikanto Shabbos Rotzisa, right? That's how we begin Musaf. Here we go. Le Moshe Tzivisa B'Hasinai Mitzvahs Shabbos Zochai V'Shamai. You commanded Moses at Mount Sinai the mitzvah of the Sabbath with regard to remembering and keeping. Uvoi Tzivisanu Hashem Elokeinu. And in it, the Lord our God commanded us, Lahakriv ba korban musaf Shabbos kara'ui, to bring, to sacrifice the korban musaf as it should be sacrificed. Uvechein, and therefore, Yirotzo mufanecha Hashem Elokeinu, may it be your will in front of you, God, our God, Velokei Aveseinu, and the God of our ancestors. Shetekabel berachmim uverotzoin, that you should accept with mercy and with will, areshes sefoseinu, the words that come out of our mouth, b'mekoim karbanos chayvosenu, in the place of the sacrifices that are our obligation, to midim kesidra, musafim kilchosam, etc., etc. In other words, rather than describing the korban musaf as it is brought, and as is mentioned in the parashas in the Torah that discuss it and describe it, here it leaps ahead, the tefillah, and says, we don't bring korban musaf anymore, just accept the words that come out of our mouth. In other words, if you are somebody who is sensitive to the concept of sacrifice, you will now understand that we don't really believe in sacrifice. We just believe that this is something that's existed in the Jewish past, and we've done away with it now because we are no longer primitives. We don't bring sacrifices anymore. We're Germans. We're Christianized. Yes, we may pray in the Hamburg temple, but we're just like you, Mr. German Gentile. We're just the same as you. That's the concept here. I'm going to read you another piece. This is from the same Siddur, this Hamburg. By the way, it's very rare. I have to tell you something about rare books. I have quite a lot of rare books. But like everything else in economics, it's all about supply and demand. Something can be extremely rare, but if nobody wants it, it's not very valuable. So this does appear from time to time in auction, but who wants to buy a German Reform prayer book from 1819? Come on, no one's interested. So it's exceedingly rare. There's maybe a few hundred copies in the world. I say a few hundred, probably a couple of hundred maximum. Who wants it? Nobody wants it, besides for a Meshuggah like me. Here we go. So the next thing is that we have a tefillah that is said on Yom Tov. What do we say on Yom Tov? Umipnei, here we have it, by the way. Umipnei chato'enu galinu me'artzenu. So this is the tefillah we say in Musaf on Yom Tov. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. V'nisrachaknu me'al admoseinu, and we were distanced from our territory. Ve'ein anachnu yicholim la'asos chayvosenu beveis bechirasecha. And we are no longer able to perform our duties and our service in your honor in the place that you have chosen. Babayis hagodol v'hakodosh, in the holy and sanctified and great location that is the Beis Hamikdash. Shenikra shimcha alav, upon which you have placed your name. Mipnei hayod hashlucha b'mikdashecha, because of the hand of the invaders that was placed upon your holy temple. However, continues the prayer, Yehirotzain milfonecha Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Aveseinu, may it be your will, God, our God, and the God of our forefathers, shetekabel berachmim of rotzain areshes sefoseinu, that may you accept upon yourself, for you, with mercy and with will, the speaking of our lips, of our mouths, bimkoim korbanos chayvosenu, in the place, very subtle. The early reformers were extremely subtle. They didn't say this never existed and the fact that it existed means that our ancestors were primitive. No, that's what was then, but now is now. Now things have changed. Now we're going to change our prayers so that they can fit in with the culture of our time. We're no longer Jews who see the bringing of sacrifices as an important aspect of our religious faith. So there's a number of prayers which are omitted, and there's a number of things which are modified. This was the prayer book, the very first Reformed prayer book. It is the blueprint of all Reformed prayer books that were subsequently published, and it was put together by these two reformers, Isaac Zekel Frankel and Breslau, who we will talk about more right now. So now we have the next book, which is Eile Divrei HaBris. What's Eile Divrei HaBris? First, let me show you the title page. It's important. You should see that I'm not just making all of this up. Eile Divrei HaBris. Can you see it? Eile Divrei HaBris. This was collected letters expressing the outrage of Orthodox rabbis against the modernizing, reformist, Christianizing tendencies of the early Reform movement with the opening of the temple in Hamburg in 1818. It was the very first formally recognized, as it were, Reform temple in Jewish history. Includes a letter from the Chassam Sofer and many others, all of them writing in absolute anger and disgust at many of the things that were happening. Now, I have to tell you something important. You should know this. It's important for you to understand that the fact that there were people who wanted to reform in and of itself is not bad. Reform, if it means we want to keep people in the faith, I'm not going to use the word reform because it's such a loaded term. But if you're a Makarev, you're involved in Kiruv, and you bend certain rules to keep people in the fold or to get them through the door, that's not in and of itself reform. It only becomes reform if you say that which other people do, which is different, which is so-called fruma, more extreme, more in keeping with halacha that pre-existed, that they are extremists, and what you're doing is the ultimate form of correct. That's what makes it reform. The problem with people like Jacobson and Breslau and Frankel and others, as we're going to see, and Choriner and Kunitz and all of those others, was not the fact that they wanted to adapt Judaism within the halacha. And that's so interesting, that they used halachic precedent as the method by which they wanted to propagate their reforms. They wanted to pretend that they were a continuation of halacha. In and of itself wouldn't have been so bad if their intentions would have been pure. If it was true that this was Eshat Torah in Hamburg in 1818 and 1819, wonderful. Bring people through the door and now start getting their wives to go to the mikveh and start getting people to eat kosher and start getting people to make sure that they keep Saf Siman Kriyas Shema. That's a wonderful thing. But if you say that the Judaism that you are presenting them with is the ultimate form of Judaism, that's what makes it reform. And that those people who keep more are doing something which is unnecessary, that's what makes it reform. That's what made the Reformed Temple of Hamburg reform. Now, this is a very, very important book. This is probably the most important book of the early part of the 20th century, the theological battle between traditionalists and reformers. It's called Tzoror HaChaim. Tzoror HaChaim. It answers 9 shailas, 9 halachic questions. It's an extremely important book. It was written by Abram Aryeh Lovenstam, who was a descendant of Chacham Tzvi, and who was a great nephew of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, a traditionalist from Amsterdam, wrote a beautiful sefer to answer 9 shailas. Do you want to know what those 9 shailas were? These were all the shailas that were that resulted from the reforms that were taking place in Hamburg. Listen carefully. Koil hashir ba yavur she'osur lispala bebeis hakneses balvoyas kalei shir. Answering the shaila whether or not you can use an organ during tefillah in a shul. Very important question. It's not so important now because who wants to have an organ in a shul right now? Then it was very important. Second question. Eine lachash. Extremely important to say Shemona Esrei quietly. It's a personal prayer that has its origins in Chana, the mother of Shmuel Hanavi, who prayed silently and who was blessed subsequently by Eli HaKohen, who understood that this was the correct way to do the Shemona Esrei as a result of his conversation with Chana. That is the tradition of Judaism stretching back thousands of years. You can't do away with it. That is undermining our tradition, undermining our faith. Sifse Yeshonim ba'yavur ha'isur l'shanois nuschas ha'tfilah oy ha'brachos. You're not allowed to change the nusach. You're not allowed to change the words of the tefillah from the matbeah that pre-existed your generation. You can't just decide, I don't like the way this is expressed, I'm going to change it. You have no right to do that. That's the third shaila. The fourth shaila. An extremely important shaila. What happens if I don't understand Hebrew? Have I discharged my prayer duty if I don't know what I'm talking about? Says Rabbi Lowenstein, of course you have. When you pray in Lashon HaKodesh, even if you don't understand what you're saying, Hashem understands. And therefore it's important that you say it in the language which we refer to as Lashon HaKodesh. By the way, it's no excuse. Learn Hebrew. Learn the translation. Buy a siddur with translation so that you can refer backwards and forwards. But learn to read it in the language, the vernacular of Hashem. I've written a number of articles about this. Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language. It's not just a language like English and French and German and Japanese. It's Lashon HaKodesh. It's the holy language. Make sure that you read your tefillas in that language and make sure you learn how to read it. The fifth question, this was a very controversial shaila. Are we allowed to change our minhag? Now the truth is, many people do change their minhagim. They start off life as minhag Ashkenaz and they change to minhag Sfard. Or they start off life as minhag Sfard and they change to minhag Ashkenaz, depending on which environment. However, it depends again what the reason is. Are you doing it because you're a reformer? Or are you doing it because you want to improve your religious devotion? Another shaila that was dealt with here in Tzroyer HaChaim. Number 6. Sofer Nachriya ba'yavur she'asur lispalel o levarech bilti b'lashon HaKodesh levadoi. Tefillos, proper tefillos in the shul have to be said in the language of Hashem Yisbarach. You cannot have a chazan who reads a tefillah out in English. Chazoras Hashatz cannot be read in English just so that you can ease the understanding of those who have gathered to listen to it. It's extremely important, essential, to make sure that all the tefillahs are in Lashon HaKodesh. Number 7. You have to read Kriyas HaTorah with the cantillations. Don't say that this is some obscure ancient minhag and now we can change it and just read it out aloud. You have to read it using what we call the trop. It's extremely important. All of this is put together in this sefer, a beautiful sefer. It was republished a few times. Tzroyer HaChaim. Kisui chato ba'yavur isu gilu haroish b'beis hakneses. You can't come bareheaded in a beis hakneses. Men and women. Can you imagine? That's when it began, that men would come to shul without covering their heads, etc. And finally, Kates Hayomin. This is the final shaila that's dealt with by Rabbi Avram Lovenstam in this important sefer. Ketz Hayomin, Bayavur Chiyuv Emunas Kol Ish Yisrael. It is explained the obligation for the belief of every Jew, Bevias HaMashiach Sheigale B'mheira B'yomeinu. We all have to believe in a personal Messiah that will come speedily and in our days. Now, obviously, the reformers didn't take this lying down. I have a sefer here from this man, David Caro. I told you that David Caro was an interesting man. He deserves, in fact, Edward Kiev said he doesn't want to deal with him in his article. Sorry, not Edward Kiev. Moshe Pelly in the Festschrift to Edward Kiev said he doesn't want to deal with him in his article. He's too important. He was an educator, and he obviously was extremely educated himself, and he published this book. This book, it's called Bris MS. It's an extremely rare book. It's the first ever Hebrew public attack against Rabbonim in Jewish history. That means it's not part of some polemic, some local parochial polemic between one rabbi and another. This was a generalized attack against rabbis. We don't have to listen to rabbis. That's what David Caro said. This was a result of the Hamburg temple controversy. Then we have Cherev Nekemes Nekambris. Cherev Nekemes Nekambris was a book that was written by Breslau. Remember, he was one of the editors of the Siddur. And he wrote this book. It's a rhymed work. It's written in a satirical biblical style. It's very witty, by the way. It's a takeoff of the way Orthodox Jews would, what we call in literary terms, melitza. It's a very stylized Hebrew, but it's written in a way that's kind of making fun of those who use that melitza rabbinic rhyming style. And he wrote this book to attack all of those who attack. This, again, a very, very rare book. I once managed to pick it up. I don't remember where, but you don't see copies of this book. I've never seen it on auction, and I wonder if other people have copies of it. In any event, there was a rabbi who wrote a book to counteract it. His name was Reb Meir Leib Reinitz, and he wrote a book called Lahat HaCherev HaMishapeches, and this book is also exceedingly rare. I've never seen it anywhere, only the place where I bought it, and in it he attacks Breslau. What happened to the Hamburg temple? Ultimately, it was somewhat successful. They managed to gain traction, and they managed, as we know in Germany, to establish a very strong Reform presence. And many of the Jews in Germany were attracted, if not to Christianity, then to Reform Judaism. And ultimately, they saw that as the route out of the ghetto and into general society. I just want to add one piece. We have 5 more minutes. A fascinating piece which is not related to the Hamburg temple, but still very interesting. So you think, okay, Reform Jews and Maskilim, they were dominating German Jewry, but elsewhere everybody was very frum. Not the case. So here we have a book. It's called Darko Shel Torah. Darko Shel Torah is actually an anonymous book. There is no record of its author, but I'm telling you that its author was Rabbi Yaakov Halevi Lipschitz. Some of you may read Yated Ne'eman. His great-grandson, Pini Lipschitz, is the editor of Yated Ne'eman. Rabbi Yaakov Halevi Lipschitz was the personal assistant and right-hand man of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. When Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector died, Rabbi Yaakov Halevi Lipschitz was one of the foundation figures of what we refer to today as the Haredi world. And his greatest fear was, at that time it was a real fear, that the Maskilim and the modernizers, the reformers within what we understand to be the Litvische Welt, the frum world of Lithuanian Jewry and Polish Jewry at that time, would gain dominance. And he wrote this book, but anonymously. It's called Darko Shel Torah. Derech HaChinuch LiYaldei Yisrael. This is the book. Derech HaChinuch LeYaldei Yisrael Belimud HaTorah HaKadosha Al Pi Das Chazal U'Maseres Avos. How we need to educate our children in the correct fashion so that they know what it means to be a true Jew. We have to start at the youngest age. Don't wait until they're older, until they're teenagers. You've lost them by then. You need to inculcate them with Judaism, with Jewish values, with true Jewish faith and halacha from the very youngest age. What's important here in this book is not what he wrote. That's important in and of itself. But he had the support of the greatest rabbis of his era. That's how, by the way, how we know for sure that it was him who wrote it, because nobody else could have put together this list of A-listers in support of what he was fighting for. What's interesting here is this book was published in 1902. That the most prominent of the rabbis who he promoted as being supportive of his campaign is Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski. Now, Rabbi Tukachonon died in 1896. Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski was a Rav in Vilna. He wasn't the Rav of Vilna. He was a Rav in Vilna. And there were many great rabbis in those days. Yaakov Halevi Lipschitz was a king finder and a king maker. And he made sure that Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski emerged as the most powerful rabbinic authority. He worked hard to ensure that his voice was the voice that was heard. Here we have Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski's letter, 2-page letter, included in this pamphlet, Darko Shel Torah. He's not the only rabbi that's mentioned, by the way. There are many other rabbis who were famous by then who are mentioned, but who are don't have 2-page letters in here. For example, Rabbi Yoel Levi Feinstein of Pruzhan. Who was he? He was the father-in-law of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. Was a very great rabbi in those days. Rabbi Eliezer Gordon, the Rosh Hashiva and the rabbi of Telz, one of the greatest rabbis of his era. And then you've got the Minsker Godel. You've got Rabbi Gabriel Zev Magolius. He became later famous here in America. Rabbi Velvela Magolius. He was one of the very earliest Haredi rabbis in America. You've got Rabbi Chil Michel Epstein, who was the Rav of Novardok, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan. You've got some of the greatest rabbis of the era who are here promoting the cause of Yaakov Halevi Lipschitz, and yet the letter that he chooses to publish is the letter of Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, and that is nothing short of remarkable. The back page is a letter from Rabbi Yosef Rosen of Dvinsk, the Rogatchover, and it's with the Rogatchover that we're going to end today. Thank you so much for those of you who have been listening live on Zoom. Thank you again to George and Susie Fishman, who have sponsored today's episode of Treasures from the Rabbi's Library in memory of Laszlo Weiss, Shmuel ben Yosef Halevi, Zichrono Livrocha. And I look forward to seeing you for my next episode of Treasures next Sunday at 11, or if you're watching the video, whenever you watch it. Thank you so much, and thank you for being a part of this very important program.